Thank you, Madam Speaker. For all Canadians everywhere, for my bosses, the people of Lakeland, and on behalf of the official opposition, Conservatives oppose Bill C-50. It's dressed up as something else, but it's really the culmination and symbolic of the NDP-Liberal costly coalition's divisive, top-down, central planning, economic restructuring and wealth redistributing, anti-private sector, anti-development, anti-energy agenda known previously and around the world as the so-called just transition. The reality is anything but just. It really represents a transition to poverty and diminishment of the standard of living and way of life most Canadians are able to enjoy. I'll make that case today and expand on it later as MPs do our job and our due diligence on this bill, which is about so much more than it seems at first. The NDP-Liberals say it's about job training and helping workers in one sector develop some new skills for jobs in a, well, sector yet to get fully on its feet. But Canadians should know that it embodies almost a decade of incremental punitive policies, taxes, bans and penalties, red tape to end energy development in Canada and to kill those and all related jobs. It shows the core philosophical gap between Conservatives, and I think most Canadians, and all the other parties in this House. It puts top-down command and control planning and power in politicians and government to set and restructure the fundamentals of Canada's economy instead of job creators, entrepreneurs, inventors, dreamers, and individual Canadian citizens and consumers, which has built our country to the blessed place that it is. The consequences will be that it will ultimately make life more expensive and more unstable for all Canadians, like nearly everything else the costly coalition has done during the last 8 years. The just transition is a dangerous, government-mandated and direct threat to hundreds of thousands of Canadian jobs, will displace hundreds of thousands of workers, and risk the livelihoods of Canadians across all provinces and territories in all sectors. Mark Conservatives' words. It will negatively impact the whole Canadian economy while disproportionately harming certain people and provinces like BC, the Prairies, and Atlantic Canada, and regions. There's nothing just about it, and the government knows it. Because after months and months of naming it and preparing it, at the very last minute, this government changed the wording from just transition to their so-called sustainable jobs plan. Because it sounds better, because Canadians were worried about the just transition when they found out what it meant. So the NDP-Liberals switched it out for their own PR and political purposes. Their early framework document from last summer even admits it. But it's the same old plan anchored on the NDP-Liberals' agenda to end Canada's energy sector and to harm all the other spin-off jobs and sectors in all provinces that depend on it. The damage to Canada cannot be overstated. Whether the blind and divisive ideology of the other parties will allow them to admit this reality or not, let's get real about the stakes of this debate. Despite 8 years of layers of anti-energy policies, laws, bans, vetoes, caps, standards, penalties, taxes, and red tape that has driven billions of dollars and the livelihoods of hundreds of thousands of Canadians out of our own country, the fact still remains today that oil and gas is literally the top private sector investor in Canada's economy, and energy is still Canada's largest export. It's the leading contributor to tax revenues at every level of government, more than $48 billion last year alone. And almost a decade into the coalition's anti-energy agenda, it still directly employs almost 200,000 people with average wages that are more than double the national average. The truth is that every single provincial and territorial budget depends on revenues from oil and gas, even in provinces where the elected people pretend it doesn't pay for the programs and services their citizens expect and count on. But it does, both directly and when the revenue from the incomes of energy workers are shared across the country in transfers. On top of that, oil and gas companies in Canada are the top private sector investors in clean technology, covering 75% of private sector investment in Canada in clean tech. They've been the private sector pioneers of alternative and renewable energy innovation for decades here because energy transformation is their expertise. I'm appalled that I even have to point out these facts, and I hope we can have some semblance of a realistic debate here, since the anti-energy coalition has spent so much time dismissing, distorting, and denying it. At this point, I don't even know whether all these legislators here actually don't know the facts, which is obviously alarming in itself, or are just willfully ignorant and deliberately evasive in order to impose their own agenda. But the magnitude and gravity of what the end days of this approach will look like for Canadians means I must speak the truth, and Conservatives will keep doing so to do our duty in the best and public interest of all Canadians, which is our priority. The responsible development of Canada's natural resources has been the main driver to close the gap between the wealthy and poor, and is disproportionately responsible for the relatively high standard of living that most Canadians have enjoyed compared to other countries around the world. Energy development here constantly innovates and transforms. Engineers, inventors, and risk-takers have built a globally renowned and the most environmentally and socially responsible means to displace higher polluting alternatives, accelerate technology to improve environmental stewardship, and help reduce emissions globally. It's often the only source of job and economic opportunities in rural and remote communities, especially Indigenous communities, who make up more than double the workforce percentage in oil and gas of Indigenous people in other sectors compared to the national average. As always, vulnerable people and people in rural and remote communities and people they say they care about, and also especially on the prairies and in Atlantic Canada, are the people who C-50 will disproportionately hurt the most. The truth is, though, this whole agenda will negatively impact all Canadians and all the major sectors. It will cascade through the economy, which is already happening in real time. This top-down central planning attempt to restructure the economy will hurt manufacturers in metals, rubber, plastics, and chemicals, technicians in the oil and gas sector, workers and truck drivers in the transportation sector bringing food to grocery stores, servers and cooks in the food services, farms and ranchers and agribusinesses, hotels, convenience stores, and all individual Canadians as the cost of living goes higher and higher as a direct result of the Liberals' anti-energy, anti-private sector policies. Canadians are already bearing all of these costs of just the beginning of these anti-energy laws, taxes, and red tape. It'll get worse. The carbon tax, of course, has hiked the cost of everything with no overall reductions in emissions or improved environmental performance to show for it. It's clearly not worth the cost because almost a decade in, it's not doing what the NDP-Liberals claim, but it is fueling inflation and the cost of living crisis their government has caused. Basics, not luxuries, like groceries, gas, and home heating, are all more expensive with no end in sight. A stick of butter is almost $7 where I live. Gas has been hovering around $2 a litre in Alberta, Ontario, Atlantic Canada, more than that in parts of BC. Provinces have been working to try to lower fuel costs. Alberta suspended its gas tax, only to have the NDP-Liberals drive the cost right back up by bringing in their second carbon tax, from which no Canadian, be clear about this, no Canadian in any province is exempt. Other provinces, like in Atlantic Canada, plead with the federal NDP-Liberals to pause the carbon taxes because their residents have to choose between eating and heating and can't make ends meet. The NDP-Liberals wax eloquent about caring, but they make light of the struggles Canadians face, and they actually criticize Conservatives for being the only party actually fighting to lower costs and prices for everyone. They call names, impugn motives, distract and divide, and they keep right on rolling their agenda over everyone in the way. Layers and layers of NDP-Liberal anti-energy policies, like the No More Pipelines bill, the shipping bans, drilling bans, vetoes of approved energy infrastructure, and gatekeeping red tape designed to get to no, not to yes, have already destroyed over 300,000 jobs. Massive, long-term, promising oil and gas and pipeline investments, LNG terminals and export facilities, and mining operations have all been cancelled or delayed or can't even get started because of the uncertainty of this NDP-Liberal agenda. What really concerns me is all the costly coalition efforts, or their ignorance, about the direct link between energy development and Canadians' everyday real lives. Right now, if Canada keeps going in the NDP-Liberal government's direction, our country is on track to be one of the worst performers in standard of living increases in the world over the next 40 years. Terrible. There will be real costs, as they already are. Based on the NDP-Liberals' catastrophically failed experiment with the coal transition, which left workers and whole communities behind, this next phase of the global just transition agenda will cost Canada almost $40 billion each year it's implemented. And that doesn't even include the loss in tax revenue and royalties from oil and gas. But don't take my word for it. The government's own internal brief says their just transition plan will kill 170,000 direct jobs, displace up to 450,000 direct and indirect jobs, and cause large-scale disruptions to manufacturing, agriculture, transportation, energy, and construction, impacting a staggering 2.7 million Canadian livelihoods. That's why Conservatives stand alone opposed to this agenda. It's absolutely not worth the cost. So I want to touch on disproportionate impacts. Despite all their empty rhetoric, which individual Canadians are going to be hurt directly and the most, well, the truth is this. visible minority Canadians, and Indigenous Canadians, who are more highly represented in the energy sector, are expected to face higher job disruptions and will have more trouble finding new opportunities as a result of this truly unjust plan. That's really gross. What's really gross is that the government knows it. Dale Swampy, president of the National Coalition of Chiefs, says, quote, "There is nothing fair or equitable about it." In committee, he put a fine point on how much worse the reality of this agenda will be for Indigenous communities. He said there are, quote, "high costs to this poor plan and the, quote, crisis we now face in First Nations." He said, "Many of our communities rely on diesel generation. People have to drive for hours to get to doctor's appointments or a grocery store. A lot of people aren't on the grid. And even those who are don't have the electricity capacity to add charging stations in garages they don't have. You won't find any electric cars on the reserve." Well, that's the case for lots of Canadians all across the country. The reality is oil and gas is still more readily available for remote communities. The projects last longer, have better wages, job security, benefits, and opportunities than other sectors provide. That's just the truth. So the NDP-Liberals' plan to phase out oil and gas is bad for Canada, but it has international implications too. The ongoing attack on Ukraine should make it clear to the Liberals and the NDP that where the world gets its energy from really matters and underscores the importance of energy security. The NDP-Liberal government should actually learn the lessons from other countries instead of plunging Canada down the same destructive path. Germany, for example, ignored energy security to try and phase out its own energy sector, relied on dictatorships like Russia to supply their citizens' needs, until Russia turned off the taps and Germany was forced to bring their coal power back online. And after canceling the KXL pipeline, President Joe Biden had to plead with OPEC dictators to increase oil exports. That failed, so he had to empty the U.S.'s strategic petroleum reserve and end sanctions in Venezuela, even though he was also the VP when the U.S. ramped up shale gas and oil exports outside of North America, and the same year the U.S. imported more of that very same oil from Canada than ever before in their history. Apparently, hypocrisy abounds for the sake of domestic politics there, just like here, I guess. Of course, now the U.S. has upped the competitive ante on Canada even more, while the NDP-Liberals leave us vulnerable and hold us back. And the U.S. hasn't actually slowed down their traditional energy development and exports either. They're ramping up. Canada can and should be an energy superpower. Right. And Conservatives believe we still can be with a change of government, but not for the title. Instead, to bring home energy self-sufficiency and security for our country and for the standard of living of our citizens first, and then to support free and democratic allies and developing nations around the world. It's wild that even now the NDP-Liberals won't reverse their destructive plan, despite geopolitical realities and the necessity of stable, reliable, accessible, predictable, and affordable energy of all kinds for Canada's communities, economy, and sovereignty that is more obvious and necessary than ever. Canada should accelerate energy projects and infrastructure for energy alignment within North America and to allies around the world. Canada should maintain and expand its place at the top of energy-producing nations, supply growing global energy demand while alternative energy and other fuels of the future are in development, but not yet abundant or reliable enough for all domestic or global needs. Canada can aim to meet net zero targets while continuing to reap the benefits of the sector that's leading the entire world in innovation and clean technology. That's what an actual evidence-based policy would do. In fact, that's the only feasible way to meet Canadian energy needs, grow Canada's economy, and achieve environmental goals until other alternatives, which are currently in development, become real, viable options for all Canadians. But the NDP-Liberals are rushing ahead anyway, ignoring science, economics, and expert testimony for their own ideology. When evidence and experts show their plans massive flaws, they obfuscate through rebranding campaigns and buzzwords while ignoring or attacking any critics. For example, when the government held 2 consultation phases on it, Quebec, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and none of it were left out, the Natural Resources Committee, which I'm on, was in the middle of a study about the just transition, hearing testimony, when the NDP-Liberals brought in this bill before the work was even finished. The final report was selective to suit their agenda. As they do, it attacks Canada's energy sector, fails to recognize Canada's world-class environmental standards, and encourages an accelerated transition away from the livelihoods and businesses on which millions of Canadians depend. Instead of examining and making recommendations on practical and feasible ways and timelines for increased technological development and grid decarbonization without risking Canada's economy and standard of living. The report was twisted to prop up the bill after the fact and totally excluded the large group of witnesses who highlighted the gaps, contradictions, and realities of this agenda. And it's worth noting that during the entire 64-witness, 23-brief, year-plus long study, only one non-government witness ever called it sustainable jobs. So it's almost insultingly obvious as the cynical last-minute attempt that it is to obscure their real aims and the real consequences. Listen, the Liberals already failed their just transition attempt for 3,400 coal workers in 14 communities, and they are, whoever they are, says past behavior is a good predictor of future behavior. Last year, the Environment Commissioner said that plan failed by every measure, left those workers and all those communities behind. Now they claim they can do this for 2.7 million workers across every sector of the economy. Call Canadians skeptical, and rightly so. Bill C-50 is more of the same. It will be that kind of failure, and that's why Conservatives also oppose it. But the key question for Canadians is, what's the experience of other countries who are 30 to 40 years down the road of the policy agenda imposed by the NDP-Liberals on Canada? Well, the answer is alarming, and it should cause a serious pause to elected representatives in Canada here at home. In European countries, after implementing various just transition policies in the late 2010s, electricity bills doubled from 2021 to 2022. But let's talk about some specifics. German citizens faced a 200% increase. Scandinavians saw imagine this, 470% increase. Like, what does that even mean? 470% increase in power bills. That was, of course, before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In the UK, literally 3 days ago, governments are stopping big elements of their anti-energy policies, including their ban on internal combustion engines and the transition away from natural gas heating. They're removing their tax on jet fuel, oppose calls to ban new oil and gas production in the North Sea, and the UK is, of course, extending coal plants' life cycles through next year. This will continue because this approach doesn't work. In Australia, the government scrapped the carbon tax after it made everything more expensive, harmed resource development, a pillar of their middle economy, just like Canada, although they've got many advantages over us, and caused a spiral of damage across the board, and instead now use incentives to spur clean investment and clean energy development like we Conservatives propose. France axed their carbon tax more than 5 years ago in the midst of soaring prices and escalating cost of living crisis and riots in the streets. In Sweden, the government has slashed taxes on gasoline, just like what Conservatives have been calling for here at home, and actually announced a surprising pause of all of their policy efforts towards net zero this past summer, instead of tripling taxes and plunging ahead down this perilous path. Germans, of course, have gone on to bring back online 15 coal-fired plants with extended life cycles to combat rising power costs, which also contracted the country's GDP. And now coal accounts for a third of German energy generation for 5 million homes. That's just a few of the many countries that are farther ahead of Canada down this road and are backing up because of the consequences, the severity of the consequences for their citizens, escalating cost of living crisis, skyrocketing power prices, falling GDP and standards of living, crashing power grids and unstable fuel sources, risk to sovereignty and vulnerability to hostile powers. Now, all that's becoming very familiar to Canadians after 8 years of this Prime Minister, but it's not a coincidence. Instead, it's a consequence, and it is all connected. Conservatives plead for the NDP-Liberals to get this reality before it's too late, and we will keep fighting to protect, to maintain Canadians' livelihoods, opportunities, and the standard of living while maintaining the best and ever-improving environmental performance in the world that we know Canadians expect. The Liberal NDP's just transition must be considered in the context of all these cost-hiking measures on Canadians that they've imposed. They will increase the cost of living, kill Canadian jobs and communities, risk economic activity, jobs, and tax revenue to all levels of government from Canada's largest sector, and will jeopardize the reliable, affordable, and abundant energy that Canadians need every day. Instead of examining practical ways and timelines for grid decarbonization without risking the economy and the livelihoods of millions of Canadians, the just transition attacks Canadian oil and gas workers and all the other jobs and businesses that depends on it. Environmental stewardship must be addressed with realistic, concrete, and effective measures. Conservatives want realistic transformation, not transition, technology, not taxes, and the evolution of energy sources to be led and paid for by the private sector, not forced by a government's command and control agenda. Conservatives believe Canada must develop both our traditional and alternative energy sources and support the development of industries like hydrogen, biofuels, wind, solar, nuclear, tidal, and other innovations. We will make both traditional and alternative energy affordable and accessible, accelerate approvals on infrastructure and export projects, and greenlight green projects. We're the only party.
I'm sorry, the honourable member's time is up.